World history as foretold or prophesied by Daniel the prophet is at a very high level. It provides more of a framework for history into which the individual building blocks of that history can then be inserted. The history also focuses predominantly on the areas of the Middle East and Europe. It doesn't get down to a lot of individual nations or rulers. It doesn't have Australia or China or New Zealand, but it does incorporate the whole world towards the end. So we're not going to get into a whole lot of in-depth history. What we're going to see is that this foretelling provides a really good summary of God working out his plan with the earth. It provides credibility for God and the Bible, and it provides us with an option for some hope and certainty to hang on to in our lives. Those are the key outcomes for us. It's a story that starts in around 600 BC and which continues to run. It's affected the world we live in now and will affect the world we can live in the future. The story starts with the Empire of Babylon and goes on through history to the present day and into the future beyond today. The accuracy of the story is almost incredible, and it would be if so much of it hadn't turned out to be true. We know it's true because the story includes its own meaning, and we only have to turn to history to verify it. So here's how we will cover the topic tonight. First of all, we'll summarise what we can expect to learn, our learning outcomes, and we'll summarise these again at the end. Then we'll look at some background and look at who Daniel was and how he came to foretell world history. We'll look at what Daniel foretold, and that's the story largely of Daniel chapter 2, which Dave's read part of tonight. Then we'll have a look at validating the prophecy. That's where we really see the strength of this. And then finally, some key lessons for us at the end. So first of all, then, to our learning outcomes for tonight. First of all, we'll understand a high-level framework of what we can expect from Bible prophecy, because the Bible, a lot of it is prophecy. It's not just Daniel chapter 2. There's many prophecies in the Bible, and Daniel chapter 2 will set us up with a framework for understanding those additional prophecies. We'll see how the foretelling provides a reference point for more detailed prophecy and world history, emphasising the unfolding purpose of God. We'll see that the foretelling provides credibility for the Bible, and it also provides confidence in the fulfilment of future prophecies, and I find it very powerful in this regard. It's also going to provide evidence for the existence and the power of God, and this is a key lesson for us to take from this story. That's an important point, because as well as being about history, this story is also about competing belief systems and opposing gods. If you're into reading fantasy, then you'll relate to this. But this story carries far more weight than any fantasy novel. Even if history is not your thing, this story should still capture your imagination. It's amazing. It's setting up the framework and credibility for Bible prophecy, but it's also about the power and supremacy of the God of heaven. If you've got a coloured pencil, get it out now and be ready to use it, because God of heaven, and you might have already picked up Dave referencing that in his prayer, but God of heaven is a repeated phrase through this story, and it's worth colouring it in because it is one of the key points to take away. The point of this is that it is the living God, the God of heaven, who has the power. The Babylonian gods, as we'll see, were nothing. The power of the living God is an underlying theme right through this story. It's also important to note that even if you might not be much into history, this story is also about the present and the future. But remember that that's always built on the history. What's in this prophecy for you? Well, it's a foundation for trusting God and the Bible. It gives you options. If you've never considered the Bible to hold any weight or credibility, this story can provide that and open up the Bible as an option for you for life. And it gives confidence for the future. So let's now look at the background to the story, and first of all, who was Daniel? And so what the biblical book of Daniel, which we've read from tonight and from which our story tonight is taken, tells us is this. Chapter 1, verses 3 to 6, we find that Daniel was a Jewish prince. We find also from chapter 1, verses 1 to 2, that he was taken captive by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar in 605 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar's army captured Jerusalem. From chapter 1, verse 4, we find that Daniel was a wise and intelligent man. And because of this, he was chosen by Nebuchadnezzar to be educated in the ways of the Babylonians, to participate then in the management of the kingdom. In this, he had access to all the wisdom and educational opportunities of the Babylonian kingdom, as well as the same standard of food and drink as the king. But what we also find is that despite all these opportunities and some might say temptations that were in front of him, he never allowed the ways of the Babylonians to override his commitment to his God. And we see this throughout the book. Daniel is noted for continuing to serve his God and not the Babylonian and later on the Persian gods. This included rejecting the king's diet. We may argue that a diet heavy in red meat and alcohol is not healthy for us anyway, but for Daniel, he knew that food had been offered to other gods before being served, and he did not want to identify with those gods. Perhaps the best example of Daniel's ongoing devotion to his God is that he's known for praying to his God 3 times a day. And later on we find that he became a senior minister in the Babylonian kingdom. So that's Daniel. And come back now to around about 600 BC and the start of this story in ancient Babylon. It's about a clash of nations and a clash of gods and belief systems. King Nebuchadnezzar is reigning over an empire that stretches from the Israelite territories on the Mediterranean Sea in the west through Syria and Iraq to the Persian Gulf. He's conquered all this territory and sits as its undisputed ruler. And he's no slouch. Not only has he been successful militarily, he's intelligent and recognises that amongst those nations he's conquered are other smart and intelligent people who he can use to further his ambitions and consolidate his power, while at the same time reducing the risk of rebellion in the conquered territories by removing possible leaders. These he brings to Babylon to teach them the wisdom of the Babylonians: maths, astronomy, superstitions, diplomacy, public relations. Probably hundreds of thousands of captives are brought into Babylon, and among those selected for Nebuchadnezzar's training course are 4 Jewish captives. Their names are Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Their names all honour the Israelite God, Yahweh. Nebuchadnezzar changes their names to names honouring the Babylonian gods. He calls them Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they become members of the Babylonian cohort of wise men. One night, King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and he was greatly troubled by this dream. It really disturbed him. And Daniel chapter 2 picks up the story. Daniel chapter 2 is really the only section of the Bible we need to look at tonight, because the story gives its own interpretation. It's a long section of the Bible by the Bible standards. The Bible, in fact, is notable for its brevity when compared to the impact of the words and the message. So the number of words dedicated to this story should make us sit up and take notice of it. So verse 1 tells us that Nebuchadnezzar had a dream and he was really worried about it. The word troubled there in verse 1 means he was agitated. He was so worked up that he couldn't go back to sleep. So verse 2, he calls in his entire team of magicians and dream interpreters. And the verse lists them off: magicians, astrologers, sorcerers, and Chaldeans. These were the heavy hitters, the smartest guys in the land. They weren't just the team who could provide some light-hearted, rabbits out of hats after dinner entertainment. These were the team who advised the king on whether to go to war, who consulted the gods on matters of state and key strategic decisions. Their advice was valued and could change the course of the kingdom. The king placed enormous faith in them and their capabilities. Collectively, they were known as the Magi, where incidentally is where our English word magician comes from. It was into this team of Magi that the king was inducting Daniel and his friends. So in marched the Magi, who knows what time of night or early morning it was, and the king tells them he's had a troubling dream. And the Magi ask what the dream was, and promised to provide an interpretation. But the king makes an irrevocable command in verse 5. If you've got a King James Bible, you'll see that the king says, "The thing is gone from me," which can make it sound like he'd forgotten what he dreamed. But if we look at some other translations, "the thing is gone from me" is talking about a command that he's made, an irrevocable command which he has made, and that is that he needs the Magi to tell him the dream and the meaning. He says they have to tell him also what the dream was as well as the interpretation. And if they don't, then he was going to have them torn apart and their houses destroyed. By contrast, if they were able to do as he demanded, then he would shower them with gifts of gold and great honour. Now you could argue that it's perhaps 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, he's had a bad dream, he's agitated and worked up, but that's still the command that he's given. You have to tell me the dream, you have to tell me the interpretation, and if you can't, we're going to have you torn apart and trash your houses. And the poor old Magi, who perhaps had also just been pulled out of bed, were like, what's going on here? And it was a stretch for the Magi to try and meet this command that the king had given, because they had no idea what the dream was. If they had something to work with, they could come up with a plausible explanation. But without that, they had nothing, and the king knew it. It shows just how concerned he was about the dream, that he knew he had to get the right answer, and to get that, he had to get his Magi to tell him the dream. If he told them, he knew they could make up anything. And once we understand that the thing is gone from me and what that means, I think Nebuchadnezzar actually knew what his dream was, and the Magi knew it too. And so we see an argument develops in the next few verses where the Magi end up saying that it's a rare thing that the king requires, that the only ones who can do it are the gods, who don't dwell with men. Maybe the Magi could have consulted with the gods, but maybe they also knew that they would not get anything there. Their attempt at reasoning with the king backfires, and he becomes furious in verse 12 and commands that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. Now, you could say that's a bit self-defeating, because what's he going to do the next time he needs some wise men? But in the end, he was a despot, and he could say what he liked in the heat of a moment and get away with it. Probably got to feel a little bit sorry for the Magi too. They were in a no-win situation. But, as I said, these were the heavy hitters. They built themselves up a reputation and probably a very comfortable lifestyle to go with it. But consequently, it had backfired on themselves. They'd backed themselves into a corner, and potentially this was now going to cost them their lives. But one point to take out of this exchange is what the Magi say about the gods. They said that what the king wanted could only be given by the gods. And perhaps it says something about how the Magi really saw themselves, that they didn't try and get this information from the gods. But the king was going to find out that what the Magi said was in fact true. He just wasn't going to find this out in the way that he expected. And this becomes one of the key themes in this chapter of the Bible, and a key lesson for us too, so watch out for that. But the decree had gone out, and the executioners wasted no time in carrying it out. Even though Daniel hadn't been part of the group that wasn't able to tell the dream, he was included in the decree, and he's suddenly confronted by a man named Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, or as it can be translated, the chief of the executioners or slaughtermen. And maybe he had his sword drawn, probably had lower-ranked executioners with him, and it would have been a frightening sight to Daniel. But it says something about Daniel, that he had the presence of mind and the maturity to know what to do or what to say to hold off the chief executioner, which he did in verse 14 of the chapter that we've had a look at tonight. And he answered there with counsel and wisdom. He asked what was going on, why the speed, and Arioch explained it. And Daniel was able to get an audience with the king, no less. Goes to the king, and he got a stay of execution for all the Magi, while he went off to approach his own God with his 3 friends to seek mercy, that he and his friends might not be destroyed. Remember what we said earlier about the relationship that Daniel had with his own God. He never faltered or walked away from that, regardless of the environment that he was in. And here's an example of where he's going to his own God. It's worth thinking about this. He was a trainee Magi, he was a captive, and here he is changing the mind of the most powerful man in the world. And Daniel, I think we can say, was an amazing man. So as well as intelligence and wisdom, he had a deep and profound relationship with his God. And verse 18 gives us that first mention of the God of heaven. And this is in the context of him praying with his 3 friends that they would desire mercies of the God of heaven, concerning this secret. So that's the first one to colour in if you want to do the colouring in of the phrase. God of heaven is there in verse 18. It's also then in verse 19, it's in verse 37, and finally it's in verse 44. So Daniel has this personal confidence in his God. He goes home, and we can perhaps imagine him deep in prayer with his friends, praying that this secret will be revealed to them. And the secret was revealed. But before we're told what the secret is, we get Daniel's reaction to it. And it contributes to building up a picture of what Daniel's God is like. Daniel describes his God as the God of heaven, as we've seen. There it is in verse 19. And then he lists off God's characteristics, which are there. Wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes and sets up kings. That's an important one for the rest of the story. He gives knowledge to the wise, which is what he's done for Daniel. He gives knowledge to them that know understanding. He reveals the deep and hidden things like the king's dream. He knows what's in darkness, and light dwells with him. And finally, he is also the God of Daniel's ancestors. So that gives us a picture of what Daniel's God was like. These are all the things that Daniel says about it. And I think it's key that he says those things before we get into the interpretation of the dream. We're set up at the start to understand what the God who revealed the dream is actually like. It's important to take a moment just to reflect on that. This God is the God of the whole Bible. The Magi said that the gods don't dwell with men, and the God of the Bible doesn't dwell with men either. He's called the God of heaven, but he desires a relationship with mankind. And look at the connection in that list that he has with men. You can see there he gives, he reveals. He had a connection with Daniel's ancestors. The Magi didn't even try and connect with their gods, but Daniel had a close personal connection with his. And I think the contrast is very stark here. As we get further into the story, as I say, it's a useful background. Now, with the secret revealed to him, Daniel goes by Arioch, stops the order to kill the Magi, and gets another audience with the king. And that's where we pick up the story now in the section that Dave read for us at the beginning of our session tonight. And the king asks if Daniel can give the dream and the interpretation. But Daniel responds saying that it's not him, and it's certainly not the Magi, but there is a God in heaven that can do this. And there's that emphasis on God again. And then Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar what God had revealed to him, the dream. So that brings us to our next section in our talk here. We've read the dream from verse 31 to 35, the great image in the form of a man. And I saw some people down the front here, looks like they were drawing that perhaps at the start, just waiting to start, which is important because we're actually going to be able to put some notes around that so you can get a bit creative in how you draw your image. That's fine, but the interpretation and the meanings you can write alongside of each section as we go through. So this man, or this image, is made from different metals, and as we go down, we'll see that the value gets progressively lower as they go. You've got a head of gold, you've got a chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs that are made of brass, legs of iron, and then feet that are part of iron and part of clay. So then it's absolutely the opposite way to how anyone would naturally build an image like this. You wouldn't have the weakest elements at the bottom and the heaviest element at the top, but that is how this image was set up. And it was scary too. It was shining brightly and it was frightening to look at. And I can imagine that it must have looked alive and fierce, glaring down at Nebuchadnezzar in his dream, exuding perhaps an arrogance and disdain for Nebuchadnezzar that would have been completely foreign to him. And you can understand why he was so troubled and agitated by what he saw. But it got even more troubling because then the king saw a stone cut from the surrounding landscape without any hands, and it hurtled down and smashed into the feet of the image, causing the image to crash to the ground, where the stone ground it down to the consistency of chaff, and the wind blew the powder away. The menacing image had vanished, and the mysterious stone grew into a great mountain, filling the entire earth. So that was the dream. And Nebuchadnezzar would have been hanging on every word now, knowing that Daniel could indeed deliver. He'd accurately described the dream. Now what would the interpretation be? Whatever it turned out to be, that would be accurate too. And the interpretation starts in verse 37 and goes to verse 45. And to begin with, Nebuchadnezzar is identified as being represented by the golden head of the image. And Nebuchadnezzar probably felt pretty good about this, maybe even thought it was obvious. But look at the way that Daniel introduces it. Daniel acknowledges Nebuchadnezzar's supremacy amongst the kings of the earth, but he states that the only reason that he's where he is because of the God of heaven, the same God who has revealed the dream to Daniel. That's the God that has put Nebuchadnezzar there. He's not there because of anything that he'd done. So remember what Daniel had said about the God in heaven? Back in verse 21, it says he removes and sets up kings, and Nebuchadnezzar was one of those kings. And just as God had set him up, God could remove him, which is what's described in verse 39, with another, albeit inferior kingdom, which was to come after the kingdom of Babylon. And that's how the interpretation of the dreams unfolds, with kingdom following kingdom. And the fourth kingdom displays the characteristics of iron, being strong and destructive. So there's our image. And the fourth kingdom is not immediately superseded by another single kingdom. That kingdom fragments into a kingdom of mixed strengths, still with some iron characteristics, but also with the characteristics of soft clay, two elements that don't combine well. And this represents the state of the remaining kingdom. It's interesting that although it's described as a single kingdom in verse 42, in verse 44 there is mention of kings, plural, and in verse 44, kingdoms, plural. And it indicates that the many parts have their own rulers and territories, but there's a single underlying idea or mindset that unites them in spite of their varying levels of strength. It's in the days of these kings that another united kingdom would emerge. This one set up by the God of heaven, the same God who revealed the dream to Daniel. And this kingdom is never destroyed. It stands forever. God retains control of this kingdom, and it breaks in pieces and consumes all other kingdoms, and his kingdom stands forever. The stone cut out without hands that crushed all the elements of the image, that is not forgotten. That is a special reminder to Nebuchadnezzar that the revelation comes from the great God, and the dream is certain, and the interpretation is sure. So at a very high level, here we have a prophecy given of unfolding world history from the time of the Babylonians right through to some point at which God sets up a kingdom. That's a long stretch of time because God's kingdom hasn't happened yet. So this timeline goes at least through our time. You may ask whether that is far-fetched. No, it's not. Because we can fix the start point of the dream, we only need to check history to see what happened. And so that's where we'll go now, to validating the prophecy. So what did happen from the time of the Babylonians, and does it match up with what Daniel described in the king's dream? What we're looking for at a really high level is 4 empires in succession, beginning with the Babylonians and covering that general geographic area. After the 4th empire, we're looking for fragmentation of that area into multiple states or smaller nations. And so, did that happen? Well, I've checked multiple history resources to see what happened and to avoid confirmation bias or just finding one that suits me. And everything I've looked at tells the same story. In some cases, dates may vary by a year or two, but the overall story is the same, and it's just what Daniel said. You can put various search terms into Google and look up multiple encyclopedias and Bible dictionaries, and you'll find various parts of the story. Piece by piece, you work out what to look for. But I want to point out 4 particular resources that gave me almost all of it in each one. I haven't put them on the screen, but I can just read them out. First of all, the Penguin Atlas of World History. Secondly, the Zondervan Pictorial Bible Dictionary. And thirdly, an online encyclopedia called World History Encyclopedia. And fourthly, I did use Wikipedia, not my primary resource, but one that's commonly used. And I wanted to check that and check what story that was told on Wikipedia, given that anyone can go online and edit the articles. But it too confirmed the story that I'd found in my other resources. So let's see what happened. Well, we can fix the opening of the story. It's the period of the Babylonian Empire. And while Babylon as a state had been around for a while, its empire status is dated from the accession of the King Nebuchadnezzar in our story. In fact, he's Nebuchadnezzar II, and his reign is generally taken from 605 BC. So there's our first empire. And what is not in doubt is that this Babylonian Empire ended, and that was in 539 BC when they were invaded by an alliance of the Medes and Persians. Generally, that's the area that the Babylonian Empire encompassed. And you can see in the green on your left, you've got the land of Israel beside the Mediterranean, and the red line is the journey that the captives took as they were taken after the capture of Jerusalem across into to Babylon. And so the area in the green there is the area that the Babylonian Empire covered. And so just as Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar, just as he foretold, the Babylonian Empire ended after 66 years. And so the first part of the interpretation of the dream, that is fulfilled. So what about the Medes and the Persians? Well, having conquered Babylon, they expanded their empire, the Persians soon becoming the dominant party and dropping the Medes out of the picture. They occupied considerably more land than the Babylonians, and you can see it on the map here. And you can see now it's expanding out towards India. And also they pushed further out the other direction as well, out to the west and out towards Greece. Although larger geographically, the empire was inferior to Babylon in that the rulers were not as powerful within the empire as Nebuchadnezzar had been within his. They were more accountable for their actions rather than being despotic and imperious in the way that Nebuchadnezzar had been. It was from Greece that the demise of the Persians would come, with the rise of the Macedonian ruler Alexander the Great. He began to push west into Persian territory with great success, but he also had a smaller army compared to that of the Persians. And despite his growing success, the Persians were not too concerned, despite losing territory to Alexander. They underestimated, though, his tactical genius, and some major Persian losses culminated in the defeat at the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC. This led the Persian king to flee, and he never recovered, leaving Alexander to sweep across the Persian Empire. This battle is decisive, and 331 BC is generally regarded as the end of the Persian Empire and the beginning of the Greek. The Greeks indisputably took control from here, with Alexander pushing the boundaries of his empire as far as India and Pakistan. Interesting, in light of the metal representing Greece in the dream, the armour of Greek soldiers was made predominantly of bronze. However, despite all this success, Alexander died in 323 BC, and he didn't have any clear succession plan. And so his empire was divided up amongst four of his generals, known collectively as the Diadochi. Several of them fought amongst themselves almost continually. However, their areas of control looked largely like this. And you can see a large area in that area out towards India, the orange down into Egypt, and then smaller areas over in Greece. Trouble developed for the Grecian territory over on its western border with the growing strength of Rome, which began to flex its military muscle and push east. And this brings us to the fourth of the empires, the Roman, which succeeded the Greek Empire. The Greek Empire didn't capitulate all at once, though. It happened over a period of time, and this can lead to there being a couple of dates for the start of the Roman Empire. Some historians will date it from the point at which Rome conquered Macedon, which is up in the sort of top left of your of the map there in the yellow. That was the first of the territories of the Diadochi to fall, and that happened in 146 BC. But most historians will go for 64 or 63 BC, when the last of the Diadochi territories fell, this being the Seleucid territories, which is that big area in the green. I've gone for that date because that's when the Greek Empire in any form finally came to an end. By 63 BC, the Roman Empire was established and it pushed up into Europe rather than enforcing its rule out to the east. And we can see how the area of influence changed by looking at this map here. You can see how much of Europe that covers, encircling the entire Mediterranean. What's common to all empires that we've seen, though, is the area at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, the land of Israel, where Daniel had come from. The Romans crushed and subdued as they expanded their empire, keeping a tight grip on control. Compared to the Greeks, whose culture largely survived beyond its political iteration, the Romans were much less refined, being brutal and unrelenting as their legions expanded the borders of the empire. And that was predicted in what Daniel said about the iron in verse 40, as much as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things, and it will break in pieces and bruise. And that's what the Roman legions were like. The Roman Empire is a fascinating study on its own and expanded on elsewhere in the Bible, notably the book of Revelation. But for the purposes of Daniel foretelling world history, we need to look at how this fourth empire developed and then came to an end. You can see the amount of territory there, and the expansion of the empire got it to the stage where the emperor of the time, Emperor Diocletian, thought it was too big to manage as a single entity, and so he split it into two sections, east and west. With the empire represented in the dream by the two legs, it should not be surprising that we find something like this. Emperor Constantine reunited the empire briefly, but he created a new capital in Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul, so that's across in Turkey, and he called that New Rome. But after his death, the empire fractured again. He left the empire to his three sons, and as you can potentially guess, they couldn't agree on how things should be done, and the empire split again. They had a western half that was ruled from Rome, and an eastern half ruled from Constantinople. Each half had its own emperor, but for the most part, they did support each other. However, the western part came under increasing pressure from the Germanic tribes to the north, and together with being weakened internally through economic and social factors, was not able to withstand this onslaught. The Western Empire fell in 476 AD when Odoacer, a Germanic tribesman who'd become a Roman military leader, deposed the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus. Apparently he was only 16. And Odoacer then ruled Italy as king, not an emperor, and the rest of the Western Empire had already been overtaken by barbarian tribes. So all Odoacer really got was Italy, the boot there, into pointing out into the Mediterranean. So he ruled there as king. He sent the vestments of emperor across to the east. He said he wasn't going to be emperor, he was going to be king, and there was nothing that the emperor over in the east could do. And so that was the end of the Western Roman Empire, 476 AD. The Eastern Empire continued on. It became known as the Byzantine Empire until it was defeated by the Ottoman Turks, who were Muslims, in 1453. And so these two dates, with those, the Roman Empire ended once and for all. With the fall of the Roman Empire, its territory then was divided up, and no replacement empire emerged in this area. The Ottoman Empire grew in the east, but in Europe, where the Roman Empire had dominated, a series of smaller nations and tribes became established. That's what I wanted there. They were loosely united on a religious basis through the surviving Christianity of the old Roman Empire. But this Christianity, it developed into the Roman Catholic Church, and the Church and the various states relied upon each other at various times to maintain their legitimacy. An example of that is that of the Frankish king Charlemagne. He reigned over an area that's part of France today, and his English translation is Charles the Great, and he would have preferred to be a self-sufficient king, but he had to rely on the Pope, the Catholic religious leader, to provide legitimacy in the eyes of the people. The Pope, in turn, would have preferred to have supremacy and security on his own, but he had to rely upon the military might provided by Charles to keep his position. So there was a symbiotic relationship, but the parties were as different in characteristics as iron and clay, and there was never political unity. The nations varied in their size and power as well, which is represented by that mix of iron and clay in the feet of the image in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. I'll just go back there for anyone who's still writing down interpretation. That's really, if you're wanting to take an illustration away from tonight, that's what you really need to be able to write down. The parts of the image, the metal that they were made of, and then what each part of the image represented, which empire, and the dates for those empires. So the next part of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the stone crashing down and pulverizing the image, has not yet been fulfilled, but we know what it represents. It represents the God of heaven setting up his own kingdom, a fifth empire, if you like, but one that will go beyond the boundaries of the earlier empires to take in the whole world, and it will last forever. I think Daniel chapter 2, verse 44 is one of the key verses in the Bible to understand where the world is going and the purpose of God. And I just want to read that verse because I think it's just so important. In the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. The big thing for me is everything else in the dream has been fulfilled, and fulfilled accurately. So why wouldn't this final part of the dream also be fulfilled? That's the big point to take out of this. If you've been wondering whether there is a God, Daniel chapter 2 provides credibility that there is. If you've been wondering whether the message of the Bible is true, Daniel chapter 2 provides credibility that it is. Look at the emphasis on God in the chapter. Daniel believed it right from the get-go, but look at the reaction of Nebuchadnezzar in verse 47. Here's the recipient of the message, and here's what he says. Daniel chapter 2, verse 47. Then the king answered unto Daniel and said, Of a truth it is that your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings and a revealer of secrets, seeing thou couldst reveal this secret. Nebuchadnezzar, most powerful man in the world at the time, had no doubt about the power of Daniel's God, the God of heaven. And most of the dream was unfulfilled at that point. Shouldn't that provide even more reason for us to believe in the power and message of that same God? I'm just going to skip forward now, and I want to have a look at a verse from earlier in the Bible, from the book of Numbers, chapter 14, verse 21. See it on the screen there. Again, one of the most important verses in the Bible, and it says, this is the words of God, As truly as I live, all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord. And there's some supporting verses there as well, Isaiah chapter 11, verse 9, and Habakkuk 2, verse 14, two examples of other verses in the Bible which say the same thing, but there's a much longer list than that. Daniel chapter 2 backs that up through showing how God has controlled world events and through putting some detail into how God's purpose will be fulfilled through the setting up of a worldwide kingdom. You might put Numbers chapter 14, verse 21 first, and then Daniel chapter 2, verse 44 after it, with Daniel providing some detail on how that verse in Numbers will actually come about. Daniel chapter 2 also proves God's ability to do it by providing a framework of world history that has been fulfilled. That's like the down payment on the fulfillment of God's purpose. God says, this is what I'm going to do. And we may say, prove it. And God responds through chapters like Daniel chapter 2 by saying that everything that he said so far has come to pass. You can trust me, he says. You can believe me. What level of predictability is there in the world at the moment? Who can you trust? What hope is there? What can we hang on to? We've seen tonight that God has a track record that we can trust. He provides hope. The framework for world history provided in Daniel chapter 2 is one of the keys to that. It's foundational in establishing that hope. There's a lot more prophetic detail in the Bible, but Daniel chapter 2 is the key to unlocking that and gives us a start on the credibility of God and the Bible, and that's massive. Should you now consider the Bible's message? God's plan will be fulfilled. He gives us the opportunity to align with that now. If you'd like to explore some more prophecy, keep going in the book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 5 records the fall of the Babylonian Empire, just as Daniel had given the interpretation of. Daniel chapter 7 gives another version of this framework of world history, using different imagery and giving more detail. Daniel chapter 8 gives more details about the clashes between Alexander the Great and the Persians and the fall of the Persian Empire. Beyond that, there's plenty more in other prophecies, including other fulfilled prophecies that add even more to the credibility of the Bible. But Daniel chapter 2 is the foundation. So, what have we seen? Here's the key lessons for us. Daniel's foretelling of world history provides 5 key lessons for us. Firstly, the prophecy provides credibility for God and for the Bible. Secondly, the prophecy demonstrates the accuracy of Bible prophecy overall. As I said, there's other prophecies in the Bible, and this one provides assurance that Bible prophecy can be trusted. Thirdly, this story teaches us about the supremacy of God. He could reveal the dream, and he controls the nations of the world. Fourthly, the prophecy shows that God has a plan with the earth. And finally, God's plan gives us hope. So, to recap on our learning outcomes, here's what we found out tonight. We found out who Daniel was. We've seen what he foretold. We've seen the accurate fulfillment of what he foretold. And then we've seen the lessons for us that come from this story. We've got assurance here that God's plan will be fulfilled, and he gives us the opportunity to align with that plan now. So take the lessons from tonight with you and consider what the God of heaven is holding out and offering you.